Hey guys, today I'll be making a prediction for the 2022 Senate elections and filling in this map, which will have a major impact on the type of legislation Joe Biden will either pass through Congress in the second half of his presidential term. So with the House essentially lost at this point for the Democratic Party, the Senate is really the only thing they can cling on to. And just looking at the approval rating of Joe Biden as a whole, which is at almost negative 8 percentage points at this point, the Democratic Party will struggle a lot next year in their quest to maintain control of the U.S. Senate for another 2 years. This is the first time that they had control of the Senate in almost 6 years. And I mean, for the Democratic Party, their approval rating as a whole, throughout the country, for the first time, they're now below the Republicans in generic congressional ballot polling for the first time in years. So this really is not a good sign for the Democratic Party. The last time that the GOP was ahead in this type of poll was in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump after 8 years of Barack Obama. So the Democratic Party right now is definitely not in a good spot. They have many vulnerable incumbents. However, the GOP does have many vulnerable open seats as well because of the sheer amount of retirements that are coming in from the right. So I'm going to start off by filling in the solid states for the Democratic Party. Ron Wyden in Oregon, Patty Murray in Washington, Alex Padilla in California, Brian Schatz in Hawaii, all going to win their re-elections by solid margins. Tammy Duckworth in Illinois, the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in New York. We also have Richard Blumenthal in Connecticut and Chris Van Hollen in Maryland. However, in the state of Vermont, Patrick Leahy will not be running for re-election. He is the only Democratic senator to ever be elected from the state. Bernie Sanders is, of course, an independent, and beforehand, it was all Republicans. This is, one of the original states, basically. For the state of Vermont, whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being, they will become the second senator from the state of Vermont from the Democratic Party. So this puts the Democratic Party up at 45 seats, and for the GOP, we have many solid incumbents as well, winning the races by very large margins. So Mike Crapo in Idaho, Mike Lee in Utah, these very traditionally conservative states. In North and South Dakota, John Hoeven and John Thune. We have Jerry Moran in Kansas, who's going to make this race pretty non-competitive. James Langford in Oklahoma as well, who won his re-election by, I believe, almost 40 points in 2016. Kansas, Jerry Moran won by 30 points, and John Thune 44 points. John Hoeven 61 points in 2016. So these incumbents are going to win their re-elections by pretty strong margins. Both Crapo and Lee won by almost 40 percentage points. Arkansas's John Boozman winning by 24 points, and John Kennedy in Louisiana winning by 21 points. So these are all going to be solid for the GOP, as well as that in 2016, Richard Shelby won his re-election by 28 points. However, he will not be running for a third term, and so in the state of Alabama, it's likely that he will be replaced by Mo Brooks, who is currently the frontrunner for the GOP nomination for this seat, and that nomination really is going to be a very important race next spring, because essentially whoever wins that primary is going to win the Senate seat in the end. So at this point, Mo Brooks is looking pretty good. It's just like in Vermont, whoever wins that Democratic nomination is almost by default the next senator from the state. In the state of South Carolina, Tim Scott is not going to win by the 10% margin that we saw for Lindsey Graham against Jamie Harrison in 2020. In 2016, Tim Scott won by 24 points, so I do think Tim Scott will win his race by a pretty strong margin, as well as that Todd Young and Rand Paul both won their re-elections in 2016 by 14 points, but in 2022 in a red wave year, I think that they will definitely win both of their races by solid margins and winning another 6-year term. And finally, in the state of Iowa, Chuck Grassley has recently announced that he will be running for re-election, so definitely this seat is going to be pretty solid for him. He's been serving in the Senate since the 80s, and Chuck Grassley will be running for an 8th seat. He was the president pro tempore when the Republicans controlled the Senate, so he is the longest serving Republican in the Senate currently, but of course Patrick Leahy is the longest serving senator currently in the Senate as a whole. So with the solid states filled in, the Republicans are down at 43 and the Democrats up at 45 seats. However, there are 3 likely seats for the GOP that will put them ahead, and I do not have any likely seats currently for the Democratic Party. So I'm going to start off with the state of Alaska. This is a seat currently held by Lisa Murkowski, and the reason why I put it as likely is because I think that she will win her re-election by a likely margin against another Republican. So really, you could say that this would be a solid seat because no matter what, it's pretty much going to be a Republican in the end. But for Lisa Murkowski, she is probably going to win by a likely margin. She currently is probably going to face Kelly Tshibaka, who is the frontrunner for the GOP nomination for this seat. So Lisa Murkowski has not, of course, been the most pro-Trump senator, and she has on many occasions went against the former president, and that is why President Trump, of course, has endorsed Kelly Tshibaka for the Republican nomination. Now, I do not think that she's going to win that nomination, but I do think that she will challenge Murkowski in the end. And no matter what, at this point, even if she does not challenge Murkowski in the end, they will go head to head in the primary. And with the ranked choice voting that they're using in Alaska, I do think that Lisa Murkowski is going to end up beating Kelly Tshibaka. She does win on the first ballot as well. I mean, this is a system that was made for moderates like Lisa Murkowski, who will have not too much of a problem winning her re-election in 2022. So this puts the GOP up at 44, and to make it a tie in the state of Missouri, this is the seat currently held by Roy Blunt. He will not be running for re-election. In 2016, he barely beat Jason Kander by 2.8% in his re-election campaign, so he will not be running for a third term in 2022. And for the state of Missouri, I do think that it will be pretty difficult for a Democrat to win here. I mean, like you saw in 2018, Josh Hawley defeated Claire McCaskill by a pretty respectable margin of 5.8%. I mean, this was a good year for the Democratic Party. As you can see, they were able to win many Midwestern races, but in the state of Missouri, they were also able to win back the House. Of course, the Senate did not go too well for them, but in the state of Missouri, Josh Hawley did not win by that large of a margin. Of course, it was less than 7%, but in 2022, with this seat being open and Claire McCaskill not being a third-time incumbent, I think it will be pretty easy for the Democratic Party to actually, or for the Republican Party to win this race by a pretty comfortable margin. And finally, in the state of Florida, I have this as the final likely state on this map. I do think that Marco Rubio will be able to win his re-election to a third term by a very strong margin. So in 2016, he won his re-election by 7.7% against Phil Murphy, and in 2010, he defeated Charlie Crist by 19 points. Of course, this was a split three-way race with Marco Rubio winning basically all of the conservative votes, and Crist and Meek both splitting the more liberal votes. So in 2016, he won by a pretty solid margin, and in 2022, I don't think it will be too much different. He will probably be running against Val Demings, who has an almost 99% chance at this point of winning the Democratic nomination. I think Val Demings is just too polarizing and too leftist of a candidate to defeat Marco Rubio in a state like Florida, where moderates tend to do much better. Of course, Marco Rubio is not really a moderate, but definitely much more to the center than Demings. So this does put the GOP up at 46 and the Democrats at 45. And so now I'm going to fill in the lean seats, starting off with the lean seats for the Democratic Party. And one of the most obvious ones on this map is, of course, the state of Colorado. Now, this is a seat that I think that the GOP really has absolutely no chance of winning. I think that the maximum that they could win by is definitely a likely margin. I think that Michael Bennet could win his re-election to a third term by almost 10-15 percentage points, but that is not too likely considering that he barely won his re-election in 2016 by a margin of 5.7 points. And you got to remember that this is a very Democratic state. Joe Biden won his re-election here by 13.5 percentage points, but in 2016, this state was a lot more Republican than it is now. With in 2014, you of course saw the election of Cory Gardner, who was eventually defeated in 2020 by John Hickenlooper by a pretty strong margin of 9.3%, but I don't think that in 2022, with the circumstances as they are, with the GOP expected to do much better in the midterms, as well as the fact that Michael Bennet, I don't think is as charismatic of a candidate as Hickenlooper. I do think that he will win his re-election, but of course, again, by a lean margin. And in the state of New Hampshire, I have this as another lean seat. I really don't think that the GOP really has too good of a chance here. I'm very confused why some people are saying that the Republicans can still defeat Maggie Hassan here. It will be very, very difficult without Chris Sununu, and I hope people understand that because if you do look at the latest polling and just everything about it, there's really no chance that the state of New Hampshire is going to go for the Republican Party. Only Chris Sununu is the only Republican that has ever defeated Maggie Hassan in any head-to-head polls. Maggie Hassan defeats every other potential Republican nominee in every single poll that has been released. Even against Corky Messner, Hassan leads by 2 points in the latest poll released, but Messner will not end up being the nominee. Against Kelly Ayotte, the former senator from the state that Hassan defeated by a very, very small margin in 2016. Ayotte was the incumbent, so it was a pretty impressive victory for her. Maggie Hassan leads by 1 point in this race, by 5 points against Boldeau, by 4 points against Ayotte, and 10 points against Boldeau. So really, it will be very, very difficult for the Republican Party to defeat Maggie Hassan, especially considering the fact that in 2020, with Corky Messner on the ticket for the GOP, Jean Shaheen won her re-election by 15.6%. So I do think there will be a lean seat for the Democratic Party. And the final lean seat I have on this map for the Dems is the state of Arizona with Mark Kelly. I do think that Mark Kelly will be able to win his re-election. If this were Kyrsten Sinema, I think that almost definitely that she would lose. But for the Democratic Party and Mark Kelly was just elected in the 2020 special election for this seat, of course, winning against Martha McSally, the Republican incumbent, by 2.3%. I think that in 2022, he will do essentially the same thing. I think that he'll win by around 2 to 3%. Currently, Mark Kelly leads by pretty strong margins against every single possible Republican challenger that he has. And I mean, looking at the latest polls between him and the GOP frontrunner Mark Bronovich, Mark Kelly leads by 4 points. Its other poll, Mark Kelly leads by 10 points. So I don't think that it will be too difficult of a re-election campaign for Mark Kelly, but definitely will be one that the Democratic Party will have to focus on if they really do want to continue controlling the state. And so this puts the Democratic Party up at 48 seats, and the Republicans still at 46, but there are quite a few lean states on this map for them as well. So I'm going to start off with the state of Ohio. I think this is one of the most obvious ones. I have not put this in the likely category because I think Tim Ryan is a good candidate for the Democratic Party. I don't think that he's a candidate that can win, but I do think that he is one of the best choices that the Democratic Party could have put up for this seat. And at this point, he has a 90% chance of winning the nomination. Of course, in 2016, I mean, this is not really a good predictor of what will happen in 2022, but in 2016, Rob Portman won his re-election by 21 percentage points. He will not be running for re-election in 2022, so this will be an open seat. The GOP has some pretty problematic candidates in this race, with J.D. Vance, being especially a concern for them. But I do think that Tim Ryan will be able to perform relatively well. And if you do look at the head-to-head polling here, what you will see is that Tim Ryan actually leads in many of the polls that have been released. As you can see, Tim Ryan does lead against Jane Timken as well as J.D. Vance. It's only Josh Mandel that actually defeats him. But of course, polling is not representative of what's actually going to happen, in a red wave year, as well as the fact that this is the state of Ohio. I say that Trump won by 8 points 2 times. I'm definitely pretty confident that this state is not going to go to the Democratic Party anytime soon. So I do have it as lean for the GOP. I think that it was not a smart idea for Tim Ryan to actually take on this race. I think that he has essentially lost his career at this point. And so I'm going to move on down south to the state of North Carolina. I do think that in the state of North Carolina, the GOP will be able to hold on to it. This is an open seat currently held by Richard Burr, who won his re-election by 6 points in 2016. Of course, it will not be like this in 2022, as it is, of course, an open seat. In 2020, you did see that Tom Tillis barely won his re-election against Cal Cunningham by just 1.7 points. Now, if this were an open seat, I think this race could get pretty close. But again, Cal Cunningham was a pretty popular Democratic candidate until his scandal, and I think that Tom Tillis, of course, was a pretty unpopular candidate in 2020, which was a much better year for the Democrats. So I do think that they will be able to win this race by over 2%. We actually do have the first polls that were released here just a couple of days ago. So in the state of North Carolina, we have Pat McCrory leading by 2 points against Sherry Beasley, who is the Democratic frontrunner, and Ted Budd leading by 1 point against Beasley. So these are not the most encouraging numbers for the GOP, but definitely the Democratic Party is not even close to where they want to be at. They, of course, do have typically an advantage in the polls. And if you want to look at the 2020 polls, you can see Cal Cunningham did end up losing this race by 1.7%. So the polls are not exactly predictive of what will actually end up happening. And I think that this 1 to 2 point lead is really a lot more, considering the fact that Cal Cunningham led by much larger margins and still ended up losing for the Democratic Party. So I do have North Carolina as lean for the GOP. And finally, I have the state of Wisconsin, where Ron Johnson will probably win his re-election. He has not officially announced that he will be running again, but at this point, it is pretty much clear that he will be running for a third term, even though he promised not to 6 years ago. So in the state of Wisconsin, I have this as lean for the GOP as well, putting them at 49. Of course, the Democratic Party only needs 50 seats to win control of the Senate, while the Republicans need 51. So now I'm going to give the GOP the state of Pennsylvania. I think that in the state of Pennsylvania, they will actually end up holding on to this open seat. This is a seat that they currently held by Pat Toomey, who won his re-election in 2016 by a pretty strong margin of 1.4%, considering the fact that Donald Trump barely won the state by less than 1% in 2016. So I do think that Pat Toomey will be able to do pretty well, or not Pat Toomey, but I do think that the GOP will be able to actually end up holding on to this seat, even though John Fetterman, I think, would be a pretty good Democratic nominee. His polling numbers really are just not exactly where he wants to be at this point. And of course, it's not all about polling, and just the fact that Pennsylvania will be a very hard state for them to win. Even Joe Biden barely won and that was his birth state. He only won the state by 1.2% against one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. Trump was not at all popular in the state of Pennsylvania, but I think for John Fetterman in a Senate race, I think it will be a little bit more difficult for him to actually win. You did see Bob Casey win by over 20 points in 2018 for his reelection, but 2022 for John Fetterman, I think, will be a little bit different. So I do have the state of Pennsylvania currently as a tilt seat for the GOP, and so this puts them at 50 seats, which means they only need to win one more if they want to win back control of the Senate. And in the state of Georgia for the Democratic Party, I do think that Raphael Warnock will be able to win his re-election here. So I will be giving the state of Georgia to the Democrats, putting them at 49. I do think that Raphael Warnock will be able to defeat Herschel Walker. I think Herschel Walker is a very flawed candidate in many ways. And I also think that Herschel Walker will not be able to run the best campaign. So in the state of Georgia, I mean, even the polls show that Raphael Warnock is doing pretty well at this point against Herschel Walker. In the beginning, of course, Walker was really the only Republican that could actually lead against Warnock in a head-to-head matchup, but with the latest polls, I mean, +6, +2, I do think that Raphael Warnock is in a pretty good spot at this point in time for his re-election. He was also elected in a 2020 special election, so that's why he will be up for re-election again just 2 years later. But finally, in the state of Nevada, I will be giving it to the GOP, putting them at 51, which means I do think at this point the GOP will be able to win back control of the U.S. Senate. I do have Catherine Cortez Masto losing her re-election. I think that in 2016, she won by a relatively weak margin of 2.4% against Joe Heck, and in 2022, it will be a pretty difficult re-election because the state of Nevada really is not exactly the most liberal state in the country, and polling this, she is not exactly where she wants to be against Adam Laxalt, who leads in 3 of the last 4 polls released. So I will be giving the state of Nevada for the GOP for the first time, and this puts them up at 51. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win the Senate elections in 2022. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I will see you guys in the next video.